because Ricardo is right that tokens, if you do buyback and burn, that technically isn't delivering extra value. The collection of the fee itself into the protocol is the value, and the price kind of should reflect that. In a sense, like token buybacks are a capital allocation decision from those revenues.
Yes, people buy some governance token, but is there ever a way by which that governance token actually allows you to gain value from that treasury? That's been unclear. And actually, you could argue that it's been more psychotic than that. And we're back. Welcome.
Finally.
To episode, I don't even know how many. There's quite a lot of episodes now.
I think this is probably number 40 or something. Let me check.
Okay.
We should probably check those things before we start.
Episode 40 something, maybe. This is how much we
40.
This is 40. Nice.
Yes.
Anyway, it's good to have you back. Today we're, I guess, gonna kick it off with some kind of rant from Mika, and then we'll see where it goes. I don't know where this is going, so I'm just gonna hand it off to you, Mika, and you can go and take it away.
I think Ricardo is the one who was supposed to rant, but just to give the premise of it and our preparation for this episode. I mean, we've talked a couple of times about like the market and token prices and things like that, and this topic kind of touches on that, but it takes a kind of different lens, I think, and maybe like kind of talking about token prices through capital allocation decisions, particularly from like the team. We can also kind of go from the investor side into that, but so Ricardo made this point that a lot of teams are right now doing buybacks increasingly, and that's whether or not that has been seen that positively by the market. At least people feel like that it could be seen positively by the market, and that could drive valuations higher. So you've seen like DYDX just recently announced it, but a lot of others kind of have as well. So this is something that, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think, like, would it be fair to characterize this as kind of like a transition into more of crypto being productive assets?
I wouldn't say that having a buyback and burn turns an asset into anything productive, which was the discussion they were having on Signal some weeks back. I mean, it's a start. It's progress.
We can debate that, but like I'm more like what I'm talking about is there's been 10 years where kind of this type of thing has always been sort of somewhere in the future, probably. And I mean, of course, there's exceptions. There's projects which have done it in the past and so on. But I'd say, generally speaking, if you've had a fee on something, like if you've had a fee switch, you haven't turned it on. Even if you've had fees, you haven't used them to sort of deliver value back to shareholders, token holders, partly probably because of regulatory reasons. But now it seems to be that like everyone is kind of, or like a much wider array of the market is going in that direction. I think that's kind of like, I think that is actually a dramatic shift in the way that people are thinking about the tokens.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm not entirely sure, and not having been in the discussions between inside these teams, from the outside, at the very least, it comes across as Jupiter did it, token price jumped, therefore we can use the same thing to prop up our own token price. And I'm not criticizing it. I think that at the very least, this does use the project's treasuries for something that might bring some value to token holders, because if nothing else, it has the advantage that it may turn some of these projects deflationary. I just wouldn't say that it's, I don't know. I think it's more of people jumping on this as being the meta than anything else right now.
It could be, but why are you hand waving away? Like, it's not delivering value it's like not delivering some value to token holders. You can deliver all the value back to token holders via buyback and burn.
Whether
Whether the token ends up trading in a way that would make sense given that scenario is another matter. But like if your treasury buybacks and burns, like let's say like nobody should do this, but like 100% of all the fees that they generate, like that, it like what else could that be besides delivering the value back to the token holders?
Again, I just don't necessarily see as delivering value, because delivering value specifically, delivering value assumes that token price is going to go up because of that. What I would say is that this does, at the very least, it puts the money to work towards the token holders, which is not necessarily delivering value. That's perhaps where I draw a line.
Okay, but like it doesn't assume that the token price goes up. It assumes that there is more buy pressure than there was before, right?
That is true. If we see buy pressure as value, then yes, that's some value.
There's maybe multiple ways to do it.
It's allowing someone to exit, but yeah, sorry, go ahead, Mika.
Yeah, because Ricardo is right that tokens, if you do buyback and burn, that technically isn't delivering extra value. The collection of the fee itself into the protocol is the value, and the price kind of should reflect that. In a sense, like token buybacks are a capital allocation decision from those revenues, and maybe that's like the nuance that. And I know you guys both kind of agree with that, but that's kind of the lens at which, like, you're not. But we're also in this situation where crypto has kind of like run through like a lot of concepts in finance, and like we're kind of blindly making our way to the next thing. And in that thing, like just the fact that people are proving that, okay, like the value does go back to the shareholder in some way, or the token holder in some way, that itself is valuable right now. And also for a lot of protocols, those flows aren't completely trivial relative to the market cap. So it so happens that it also is probably beneficial for the price, because like the primary dynamic, and we've talked about this before, from which people view the kind of and are bitter about the market, is the VCs dumping on you. So they're talking about supply and demand dynamics. So this is like the valuable thing to do, and it proves that tokens has value, but it also just happens to be the counter narrative to the supply demand dynamics that were horrible before, where now, oh yeah, we naturally have a buyer in the market versus just like sellers.
Yeah, like I think we agree. But maybe the point that I want to make is that just collecting fees, if there is like no ostensible way by which that will ever be returned in value to the token holders, is not delivering value to token holders in my view, right? Like, and that's kind of the world we've been in for 10-ish years. It's like we have these treasuries. It's been largely like, yes, people buy some governance token, but is there ever a way by which that governance token actually allows you to gain value from that treasury? That's been unclear. And actually, you could argue that it's been sort of like more psychotic than that. It's been like, you buy governance token, whales of governance token vote for the value of the treasury to go to them. Yeah. And you, as a small holder of the governance token, get nothing. And basically, like you're giving value to the project when you purchase the token by propping up the price, and then it's being sort of siphoned out. And I think that world changing is interesting, but I do wonder what the regulatory aspects of this are, because like the other way from traditional finance to return value is just to pay a dividend, right? Yeah. We've not seen that happen, and I think that's because of regulatory reasons.
Yeah, there's two things on that. Maybe one is like regulatory in terms of illegal, which is like securities discussion, and one is taxation, because paying dividends out is problematic for like taxation. But for example, like if you like, but depending on the jurisdiction, but even like staking rewards, any inflation like paid out like that, whether in kind or USD denominated or ETH denominated, that's a taxable event in most places.
But
but
that's
then,
not
often income
problematic.
tax.
I mean, that's
Well,
not problematic. It's just your responsibility to report it.
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
but
But
it-
it's like a huge
but
headache. But you can get around this. Like Step does, for example, one where they.
I want to just highlight this. So that kind of yield in many places is income tax,
Yeah.
which is pretty problematic if everyone is getting it on income tax versus on capital gains. And if
Look,
you deliver it back to the token, it's by default capital gains.
I agree. What I'm saying is that it's not problematic in the sense that, for instance, if you were I don't know, in some places, in some countries, when you deliver dividends, when a enterprise delivers dividends, it's required to withhold income tax depending on if there are treaties with the other countries or not, right?
Capital
So what I'm
gains.
saying, sorry,
Capital gains.
no, dude,
Capital gains tax for dividends.
The point is, like sending out tax obligations to people from a protocol is a bit of a headache. So what you want to do is to design like Step, for example, does this where you have Step, and then you can participate in the kind of buyback dividends with X Step, but that one is like kind of locked, so you can like kind of realize the returns at your choice by getting out of X Step back into Step, and then you kind of own more Step at the end of it. So SushiSwap did this, I think, first, which is Sushi X Sushi back in the day. And there's like some smart contracting accounting reasons to do that, but it so happens also that it's very useful for just avoiding this tax problem or moving the tax problem to like the sale of that asset, which can be decided on by the holder and not the kind of not forced upon once by the protocol.
I mean, you all of these things always do raise the question of like, will your tax authority, your local tax authority, care what's actually in the smart contract? Like,
yeah, but they don't. But that's why you use this system, which is that you don't trigger transaction events, because those are the ones that you do accounting on typically. So that's why you. So like the fact that this like X Step grows in value more relative to Step is not a problem for you, because you can like move it until you realize it yourself that like Step. Yeah,
I'm just saying, not financial advice. Your tax authority may interpret.
Yes, that's true.
Step or whatever,
that is
in
true.
whatever
But generally,
way.
this is like an easier like case, because
Yeah.
you're not like taxation is typically around transactions, and when you don't trigger transactions, like that's better. But yeah, of course, this is not tax advice.
I do think that's something that we have mentioned quite a few times in the past, that people should just check their own stuff.
But like we've even had cases where, like, for example, in sort of like these multi-step staking systems, like we've actually had to do quite a lot of work with the tax authority to figure out what the taxes are meant to be, because there may be sort of like a token wrapper, but then the sort of actual activity behind it is taxed in a certain way, and so on and so on. So it gets very, very complicated very quickly. But anyhow, maybe we should go back to the original topic.
Sure.
Already
Anyway, the whole point is
like
that
you can make an argument that tokens should trade at high multiples, because you think that there's going to be a lot of growth in the future. But the argument about like returning capital back and value back to token holders, because the rights of the governance token don't tend to be so beautifully like 100% managed that you actually have perfect rights to the asset, that implies that tokens should actually trade at a discount to like what the normal legal system would allow. So your kind of valuation is the mixed between these two, where you think these are like, obviously, because everyone in crypto is still betting on growth, right? They're not betting on just like dividend value. So the valuations are higher, but then with this idea in mind, like the valuation should be lower. So you kind of have this weird combination of these two effects.
Yeah, it's like, a big treasury, good, uncertainty around how I'm going to get anything from that, bad.
well, but that's why if there's absolutely nothing around them, then it's just easier to think of these things as meme coins, right? It is what it is. You're betting on memes. You're betting on the vibes that this thing is going to beat that other thing in value over whatever time horizon you're making your bet in.
Do you guys think...
I do agree that at the very least, this buyback and burn thing takes it slightly away from that towards, because what it does bring to the table is something you can quantify. You can figure out, like, okay, the project is getting this much in income, assuming that this trend continues, they're going to be burning this many, which means that it's going to deflate in whatever result that it gives you. So this is bringing some math, some logic that you can apply, which should have a justification for what makes projects with higher income more valuable than just projects with, good vibes in a community or what have you, even if they don't have income. What I'm saying is that I still think that they're mostly doing it right now out of, this is the current meme that is working, and it's likely to stop the moment that a few projects do this and token price doesn't jump, which is what happens right now whenever there's an announcement. Hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully this does signal a trend in a changing mechanics, or actually this does signal a change towards better reason mechanics, but I'm not entirely betting on that right now.
Well, do you think this is kind of a response to sort of the market kind of very clearly demonstrating that it thinks everything is a meme coin?
That would be very optimistic. A very positive look. I really think this is people following the trend that kind of like Jupiter very visibly started, and that had a very clear impact. Or at least that's what it strikes me as right now. Again, I'm not complaining, but I don't think it's the market saying like we should be less meme coin-ish right now. I think if they could get away without this, they definitely would. Maybe
to add to kind of strengthen that point, you could say that like in sort of in a vacuum, it's returning value to token holders is the right thing to do, and over the fullness of time, those are the projects that will succeed the most, are the ones that return the most value to their token holders. However, within this kind of period, teams tend to do whatever kind of sounds best, and they might be doing this with that in mind. They're kind of doing it in a sense accidentally, correctly. And when they're doing it accidentally, the kind of correct quote unquote thing, they're not actually really maximizing value to the token holders necessarily either, because they may be doing this at a time when their tokens are trading at a very high price and they're like buying it too high and using the capital in a bad way and things like that. So I think there's a good argument to be made that like people aren't doing this with the kind of right, like maybe with the right motives even, or the right thinking, or like a sophisticated theory behind capital allocation decisions. However, it happens to be just also directionally more correct, like because over the fullness of time, the only thing that creates value for a token, unless it's money, is the overall, like it's the present value of the future cash flows. So it's kind of very simple.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. I think it is by and large bandwagoning, but at the very least they're jumping in a good bandwagon.
Yeah, like, I kind of wonder if it like matters why. Like in some, like it is kind of the market pressuring projects in the right direction. I guess the point that Mika was making is fair, which is like if they pivot, soon after, then doesn't really make much of a difference. But at least like normalizing returning value to token holders is like a valuable thing in and of itself.
I agree, and I kind of like where you started that thinking, is that like it doesn't really matter what's like, because it doesn't really matter what's correct. The market over time gets you to the right answer. So you kind of seeing this kind of thing just means the market. Yeah, it's like the capitalism is working. It's not working like in the most elegant, beautiful fashion. Like it's the kind of thing we talked about, like, oh yeah, if you do like ICOs, you have a lot of scams. So if you do anything, but this is like the market playing itself out. And while you're looking at it closely, you may not kind of be so excited about each incremental step if it's not done like always with the best ideas in mind, and like I think some of the implementations and some of the like ways things think about this is very stupid still, but it is the market going in the right direction for sure.
I'm gonna take like a slightly stronger stance. I think this is like a super big thing to happen, and the reason is that like where like, well, there's a lot of things, but like the market is now at a scale where it really does need to start competing with traditional assets. It can't solely just rest on like, oh, innovation, future is bright, blah blah blah. Like it's competing pretty directly in like institutional portfolios, and these institutions will be looking at it from a very sort of like I was going to say pragmatic. I'm not sure if that's the right word for many institutions, but they will at least look at it from like a more traditional perspective. And there you're just like, okay, am I going to sit in stocks which pay me dividends, or am I going to sit in token where I have no idea if I'm ever going to make money? And I think that is like, it's a big deal if we get to a point where people are actually like, actually, maybe I'll hold this particular token because the value accrual is sort of better in yield terms than all these stocks would be. And I think that's a big moment actually.
And look, you have to speak people's. I hadn't even seen this. I hadn't thought about this from the traditional finance standpoint when I made that remark. But you do need to speak people's language, right? People who are crypto natives might be able to get away with making capital allocation decisions based on general tendencies and whatnot, but chances are if you're allocating capital at some larger institution, you might be asked for your reasoning of why this thing and not that thing, and giving people a formula that they can throw up on a whiteboard or something, at the very least gives them that. So you're right, this might be a good step towards getting these assets more widely adopted in traditional finance institutions.
I'll actually go further, which is that I think the best returns, apart from some scammy outliers, which will happen, I think the best returns are actually going to be this. Like the best return, like someone's going to do really well finding right now, let's say a 40 mil project that does like 10 mil revenue it's returning to token holders, let's say via buybacks. And they're going to compound their position in that asset at 25% a year for a moment, and that asset is going to be the right asset from a growth perspective as well. So it's not just going to be like a weird value play, but it's actually something that starts off very small and then kind of scales as a business very large. And they compounded that position where their like position itself grew by 2x just naturally from that, and then they make like an ungodly 40x on the price appreciation from that, and that will be like a big ass winner for some fund over the next 5 years. I think that's like that if you pick that asset correctly, I think very, very few in the entire market will actually outperform you. So I think you will actually, not only is it like speaking the language of the like TradFi, it will be the way to make the most money. Fundamentals, maybe.
Fundamentals in terms of the financial side of it.
Yes,
right.
Yes. But I think there will be, of course, like someone who wins on some meme coin or some weird like infra play that again kind of outperforms some AI thing. Like there will be, of course, these hot winners, but I think you're very much more likely to be in the winner from this kind of pure financials investment than you are from one of those over the next 5 years.
Yeah, and I also wonder if this is going to, once people do get used to think in these terms, which I don't think most of the space is used to, and once people do get used to thinking in these terms, this might help highlight when projects are exceedingly bloated and overvalued, right? Because you get to look at, well, this thing is at this price, they're burning this much in fees. Why is this thing not moving at all? Oh, look, it's because the actual FDV is massive, so nobody wants to get into this thing, right? This might, or people might even start looking at how much income someone is actually bringing in, as opposed to just the current memes of TVL and this kind of stuff, which I don't think. I mean, we've discussed before how this doesn't translate well between different project types.
Yeah, another interesting thing is like if this becomes more like, I'm not saying necessarily buyback and burn as the mechanism, you can do other things as well, but if it becomes the meta, I think it would be healthy for everyone to kind of be forced to turn on fee switches, so that we can get a real view of how defensible these like projects are. Because like, okay, not having a fee switch on is like makes sense as a growth strategy. But there's probably some projects that don't have a fee switch on simply because if they turned it on, it would be forked immediately. And figuring out that is actually quite interesting and would be helpful to the market. It would be brutal for, some investors in those particular tokens, but I think it would, like, in general, help solidify kind of the business model of the market to identify verticals where it's just not possible to have like a real fee generating business. And well, the other thing that could happen is that like we identify verticals where like you can have a fee switch, but you just have you have a certain cap for how big each project can be. So like maybe some categories fragment into a whole bunch of smaller things that are actually able to generate fees versus one big thing, or something like that. And so I think in general it would be pretty helpful.
This is a really interesting conversation when like you start to talk about whether or not these like kind of the business landscape will be more fragmented or more verticalized or more like which you start to have like these more common things, which is like, okay, you can have this kind of business which you can't monetize really, but it's like a loss leader for you, or it like gets your brand out there, and you have this like other part of the business which is like wildly profitable. I would imagine something like if you have an exchange like Athena is building like an exchange and perps, and they're kind of verticalizing the entire stack, but they do own the AUM in a sense because they have a stable coin and they can generate returns on that stable coin and kind of offer all these other services at a very competitive price or something like that. Like conceptually, I don't know like the specific example, but like you start to think about a lot more of those things when you're analyzing kind of where projects are growing.
This is kind of a tangent, but it does also feel like if you have like a big business but you're not really charging fees for it, but you have like a very dominant position in the market, unfortunately it actually does make a huge amount of sense to go into infrastructure to own your infrastructure layer, like the Unichain, Uniswap in some sense. Athena is going at it from it's a sort of similar play, like that gives you like a natural way of generating revenue without actually needing to do anything that could jeopardize your dominance of the like main product. But I don't know what that means long term. Like we can't all be on separate chains.
It depends on what the use cases are. So if you think like blockchains are kind of asset ledgers, and there's financial primitives that we've invented throughout history, of which there's like depending on how you categorize them, but you can get as low as down to like there's 6 products in finance. There's like and then kind of you go from, okay, maybe you have like these big winners in a sense, which are much more vertically integrated. You essentially would have a situation where you kind of have like the 4 big tech companies, but they're 4 big crypto products, and they just own the entire finance stack across the world. Maybe it fragments into like, okay, you can own every single application, but you're still buying it off of like a general L1 like Solana, to have like some benefits of scale, or because that you don't think that part of the stack necessarily needs to be monetized or something like that.
I was gonna ask you both, since we're like, well, we all like Solana. What do you when do you think Solana runs into this issue where Solana projects start to be like, actually, I would like to run my own infrastructure?
When the cost of interoperability is lower than the benefits that you get from this, like
That's a generalized statement. Like there's also like just like, can you make more money by having your own stack? Like, if you don't need full interoperability, there are plenty of Solana projects which really don't need to touch other stuff as such.
That's what I wanted to say actually earlier when you said we can't all be on different chains. I would argue that that's not entirely true. We have discussed in the past that I think most value transfer chances are just going to happen via things like USDC, for instance, right? So basically what you get into, if you have something like Debridge or Wormhole in the middle, something where you can actually move value not through locking into some multisig, but basically, for intents and purposes, just-in-time swapping, then there really is no major issue why, say, if your preferred DEX is Athena on that other chain over there, why you wouldn't have the value that your favorite perp DEX. Why you wouldn't have the USDC value assigned for perps over there, and whatever else you're doing on Solana, you have over here. The only thing that does kill is basically atomic integration between projects. So you couldn't do like what Rift is doing, where they may have some really shitty spot volume, but they get to call Jupiter and swap in Jupiter if necessary, right? That is the kind of thing that you would lose. But if whatever you're doing is extremely self-contained and it doesn't depend on, let's say, non-fungible, non-cross-chain assets, if you don't support USDC, just USDT, as long as somebody is willing to take USDC on one end and give you USDT on the other, that seems like something where you could basically just run a chain on your own chain without any issues. Now, well, it's true that what you said, that what Mika said is a generalized statement. That the other case is also a generalized statement where you need to be on your own chain is when you want or need to either customize or speed up the consensus in some way, right? Solana is currently optimized for certain...
just you want the money. So like,
sure,
what I was kind of pointing towards is that, like, I think there is a dynamic by which these like layer ones need to sort of subsidize costs in perpetuity to make it justifiable for people to build on top of them as opposed to run their own chains. Because if they're making money, then there's a margin that could be captured by the project itself.
Okay, arguably the chain itself is not making money. The people running validators are making money, and unless your chain is a single thing where you don't involve any other validator, sure, if you run a validator there, you're gonna capture a higher percentage of that, but some of that is still going to be going to whatever validators you bring in, right? Unless, again, you're a fully centralized project, like, I don't know, your base or something, and you get to print your own money. So I wouldn't say that Solana as the Solana Foundation doesn't get fees beyond what they have from the staking on platforms, right? It is the Jitos and the Helios of the world that are running validators. Sorry?
They benefit from token appreciation and probably their
sure, and definitely people are going to be tempted at printing their own money that may appreciate as well, and they control a larger chunk of the supply. That's fair. But the thing is, I think that the temptation of printing your own money is going to be a much bigger driver than whatever extra fee percentage you could get, right? The fact that you get to raise for layer one, that's where the money is going to come in from.
Well, again, so I don't disagree. I think it's just sort of like, I'm talking about a more long-term dynamic versus like, what are the VCs funding right now? Like, I don't give a shit. But it's just more like what happened with Ethereum is sort of bound to also happen with Solana eventually. I don't know when. And like given the differential in kind of fees and the perceived, like there is an element by which like the project doesn't want to run an L1 if they can justify it financially, right? Like, or if they can just like if it works for them, it's just extra headache. They don't want to do that, unless they see that they could like make a significantly larger amount of money, or they need features that don't exist or whatever, you know. And so like it's bound to happen eventually. And I just wonder when.
Maybe like the cost to a user, I think, is the kind of thing to think about here, where like if you have a lot of different kinds of businesses that interact with the same chain, that's like a coordination thing as well. If you think like kind of world finance can run on a single chain, it makes it kind of easy to coordinate. And when you do like transfers between certain, like there's an economy of scale of like a distributed validator set and running like a lot of infrastructure that the other projects won't have, unless like some of them are so dominant relative to each other. And then you have like this kind of cost of like, okay, what is the cost of like transfer on between services on a Solana L1 versus like the cost of transfer between two application specific chains? And there, I think you can like back into essentially that the cost of transfer between the two chains is definitionally kind of higher always, because you need to like make a market between these two things. So, but so like on the kind of compute level, I think Solana is like the best way to capture all the value. What is true is that if you are the dominant DEX in the world and you are actually the number one exchange, you leak so much MEV to the L1 that's the fee that you really want to capture. So some sort of application specific sequencing is very, very necessary, even in the context of like an optimal system. So I think like some way to return that MEV optimally, and you may not need a chain for that. You just need like the market to behave like in a kind of useful way where that's like minimized, or like so that the L1 doesn't like rent seek it. Basically, then
well, the easy
but
way
if that were the case,
is to have a sequencer that you control, right? Like
what we
see. If that were the case, wouldn't just something like the Magic Blocks ephemeral sidechain kind of thing help solve that problem in Solana? Given
the network extensions.
That's the thing. Like, what do you call Solana at that point when you're like jumping for one block to a centralized sequencer that then updates the state in the global ledger on the next block? Like maybe it's just more useful to see like, okay, what's the rent seeking level that you can do on how much money can you make on like compute, and then how much money you can make on like transaction sequencing, and then how that gets divided up between like the applications and like a more general purpose asset ledger to move from one service to another. I know that's a bit of a mouthful of things, but that's generally like the kind of thing which I think if you kind of run into the limit, I think like there's some level of overthinking on this as well. I think when you run into the limit, you'll probably have like a generalized infrastructure, like which is kind of like a bridging infrastructure in a way, but then also like not really, because it's like the asset ledger itself, where you, which is a big ass business, but it's not as big ass business as like some of the applications that are built on top, which makes sense in the terms of like how Solana is thinking about itself, which is that it thinks that it will have applications on top of it which are more valuable than itself, and that's how this plays out.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to Solana improvement something SIMD 228, which you guys brought up. What does it stand for, Ricardo? You surely know.
Well, it's just 228 is the number, but it was basically, I mean,
no. I mean, what does SIMD mean?
Oh, Solana improvement document, I think, or Solana improvement something. I think it's documented.
Why would you call it SIMD, which is something completely different in most computer science?
This is because the two hardest things in computing are caching, validation, and naming things, man. Anyway, let's move on from that.
It's just trying to bandwagon like whatever other nerdy computer science stuff is what it is.
Maybe, yeah. Anyway, the
Yeah.
so yeah, the CMD, if anyone missed it, was basically that Solana currently has a fixed inflation schedule, which is kind of like decreasing yearly until it's going to end up reaching a floor of, I think it's 1.5%, which is rather simplistic. And the argument and the logic behind CMD was that it would better serve the platform if this inflation rate was programmatically defined through a curve based on how much is currently staked, so that the platform isn't necessarily overpaying for security. It didn't pass, actually. It was supposed to, it required 66% of yes votes, and it only got about 62%, 61 point something. So it didn't pass. The inflation percent remains as it is right now. The discussions as to why, it's kind of like reading tea leaves. It seems there were communication issues. There were people just projecting on Multicoin, on Multicoin was proposing this, and it's because Multicoin has ulterior motives. Who knows? But point is that it didn't pass.
So it's worth noting that, for example, all Cosmos chains work on the basis that the SIMD 228 was proposing. So there's basically like an inflation minimum and a maximum, and then a staking target. So if you set your staking target, let's say at 50%, and you're like way over that, it'll use the minimum inflation. So basically you'll have smaller emissions to try to disincentivize people from staking, so people take money out, and then the other way around. So if you're like your staking ratio is really low, then it sort of increases emissions to try to get people to stake. I think like from a kind of fundamental perspective, I think it makes sense. There are some questions around well, oftentimes in my mind, the question is sort of like, what should the staking target be? And is that like a perpetual thing? No one really knows. This gets into like the whole murky water of economic security, which Solana has some hot takes on, or at least Anatoly has some hot takes on. But I suspect the Solana, the amount staked on Solana, historically at least, correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't checked this right now, but it's been really high, right?
Yeah.
It's very high relative to ETH, because ETH had this proof of work, proof of stake thing. Relative to like other ones where there's like a VC sale, it's not that high relative to those. It's just high relative to ETH.
So do you think the impetus for this was to try to decrease that amount because it's kind of like too high?
Well,
there's two things
so
we should separate. One is whether or not Solana inflation is too high, and the second is whether you should have a targeting mechanism. And those are kind of like different.
Well,
different
but if the inflation is fixed, then basically like the threshold is probably fairly consistent over time of when people would stake and when they wouldn't. So you kind of have a system wherein, everyone is staked as time goes on, and the inflation comes down, then it hits some threshold, and then nobody is staking.
That's not necessarily a case. It's not just inflation based. I can
as
tell
long
you
as
this.
the reward isn't zero, one could argue that you should stake, and the reward is not zero just from fees.
Yeah, and it depends on market price as well.
No, it depends. It depends largely on market price actually, and how the chain has been behaving. For instance, back in 2022, when I was paying more attention to this, since I was more actively involved with Marinade, something that you tended to see was that large players who had liquid stake, would tend to move out of liquid staking when the prices started looking iffy, because I'm guessing they had spotted that during events of basically chain congestion, there was the liquid staked tokens tended to sell at a discount because there was not enough volatility in the market. So this is just an issue of risk reduction as well. It's not necessarily just related on inflation. Having a curve on the issuance could have helped others, that assuming that it crosses a certain number of epochs. So it's just not as transparent as
having
it hits the target.
Having a curve on the issuance is also good in terms of like if you have a dramatic drop in market price and the inflation is very low, you can like suddenly lose a huge amount of economic security. And if there's no adjustment mechanism, you're basically betting that the market price will go back up to regain it.
No, but why are you losing stake when the market price is going down?
It's just like the yield is sort of like not big enough, right, to keep people there.
Yeah, but the yield is still nominal yield. Like that's the thing. It's like,
look, I can tell you two reasons why you're losing stake when the price market's going down. The first one is that if you're not liquid stake, if you're using, at the very least on Solana, if you're using traditional stake, it's going to take you an entire epoch to unstake your stuff, unless you go in and deposit the stake account somewhere and then trade out. But fine, let's go with the simple case where you do not want to touch a smart contract. It's going to take you a full epoch to unstake. That's 2.5 days. Or thereabouts. If you see price approaching a point where you may want to exit this position, then you're going to want to unstake it before, just so you're ready, because things move violently. That is one reason. If you're liquid staked, then it is the reason that I mentioned earlier. You have to assume that there is going to be more liquidity between Sol USDC, let's say, than if you have to trade out of MSOL. And trading a large position out of MSOL or GTOSOL or what have you could have a larger impact for you. So those are the two reasons why I could see why some large user would unstake if price is going down.
Yeah. By the way, this is also actually an argument for, I think, in a sense, this proposal isn't sophisticated enough, which is that there should be like different rates. Like in the normal economy, there's like different rates for different lockups. And there should be like, if I'm willing to lock myself for 2 years, that should have a market price. That's how this actually should work.
That's true.
Yeah, and this isn't
it's interesting that hasn't really been done, but I fully agree. Like you should be able to commit to timelines, and that should change your yield in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
That would also give you a much better understanding of what kind of the consistent economic security is versus kind of semi everything being pretty liquid, which is then very what's the word? It is very like flighty in a sense, and you can't really trust it.
Yeah, I also find this one a bit like just a proposal. Like I get targeting like 50% for economic security. I also find it a bit stupid, like in terms of like just why that number, and then like you can do a little bit of math on that, but ultimately it's a bit handshaky or like hand wavy. But like actually having an intelligent market for like the same way you have for like treasury yields, this is what I would like want over time. Like what am I willing to pay for a lockup, and like how that. But all these things are kind of interconnected as well. It's not that simple to reason about that either when you go like long enough, but I find it a little inelegant to just like target 50%. You know what I mean? There's like something a little bit off for it for me.
It also
the thing is like why 50? Like this is getting back to what I was saying. Is like we just don't know what it should be.
Yeah, I agree.
I was gonna say that with the variable rate, it looks like it. I'm pretty sure they have thought about this, but it looks like it will get kind of weird where some validators would actually end up getting a larger rate just because the people who stake with them are sticking for longer. It's, I don't know, that one seems like it would take a while to model. I can see why they haven't done it yet, right?
Yeah. I understand why.
If I lock into a smart contract with a specific thing, it is my wallet that is getting the rewards. This one doesn't affect The fact that there's a validator as an intermediary seems to complicate things.
And I don't really have a
Well,
model either that, like, I wouldn't necessarily want to test this out on a network as size as Solana either. Like, just like my ideas on what duration risk on this shit should be. Like that's kind of complicated, you know?
Yeah, it is more long term, but this is kind of the direction it should go in. There's also another question, which is sort of like this Cosmos. I don't know who came up with this model, but this sort of like staking ratio targeting thing. Like a point, the point of it is really to target different sort of economic conditions, which makes sense, and it does it sort of in an automated way. But I always wonder, like the traditional market operates on sort of discretion, and I don't think that level of discretion is the right thing for blockchains. But at the same time, having some discretion is actually quite useful. And so like there's also, I mean, smart contract projects do things like this, but L1s tend to not, which is that like you should, I think, kind of like have the ability to do things that wouldn't necessarily make sense to, for example, try to stimulate the economy, and or to like what's the opposite of stimulation, like de-stimulate the economy if it's too frothy and so on, like sort of traditional central bank things.
Yeah, and this is
like
doing that because like you're thinking, oh yeah, we're just like putting sole tax liability on the table of 1 to 2 billion per year for no reason here, which is like sell pressure, you know. So the economy is kind of too hot because the lump sum is getting a bit large on inflation, you know.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of like, I'm sure that like we'll start seeing experimentation around this, but I think there's going to be a lot of stuff to take away from how traditional financial markets have worked. Not necessarily replicating them, because obviously they haven't worked that great in every point in time. But there is a reason why they ended up the way they are. And sort of bringing in some of those learnings is probably a good idea. Anyway, we should move on to our last topics.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say the last thing is, which is that one thing to consider here on like high nominal and real rate difference is the tax thing. It's like stupid that you have to like think about this when designing distributed systems, but like first of all, Coinbase and Binance take exorbitant fees on their staking because they can, and then like if you think of like more like people having tax liability on like receiving staked assets, like you basically get to a number that's like there's 2 billion of overhang just because of that, which just feels unnecessary. So I think there was like a variation of this, which was like maybe push like cut the inflation immediately a bit faster than you would have, and then just like hit the rate that you were going to hit kind of a bit faster and just go with that. Because I would have rather actually had that than this, because I don't really like arguing about like, it's so complicated to argue about like market mechanisms of targeting, but you could have just like shaved off some inflation, and I think people would have been fine with that.
Yeah, I think new meta is going to be like pretty low inflation rates. Basically, like as low as you can is going to be what everyone needs to do. Risks slightly longer tangent, but whatever. So anyone who doesn't know how much money validators make should go and Google it. And see if they think it makes sense. Like these guys are like upset if they're not making like 100-200% a year for running some like tiny server out of their garage. It's ridiculous. And that in itself tells you that there's like something weird happening. And it's kind of a game theoretic thing where like the yields on all these networks are so high that there's a perception that you're competing for validators, but ultimately these guys are running like a gaming like these are not, this isn't like sophisticated shit. Like it doesn't require overpaying by a multiple. And there's all kinds of arguments. So like, oh, we just spend so much time in this, so much blah 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 fiddly stuff and whatever. But ultimately, like, the fact that you can make like hundreds of % a year return without taking any financial risk in many cases, because they often get a delegation, or basically they have other token holders delegate to them, their self stake might be basically zero. It doesn't make sense. And so you should have inflation rates like quite low, because it's just better for everyone except the validators.
One interesting fact:
so for what's worth,
39% of Solana validators don't take a cut right now, and a lot of those are like companies like Helios and stuff. I wish that was the case for the entire validator set, which was like, because your situation was kind of like Coinbase, for example, does it like that. That thing extracts from Solana so heavily that it feels super unnecessary to the network. That's like your super example of that validator, because there's like no self stake essentially. It's just like huge ass customer deposits, right? But then like Helios can run this thing as a loss leader where they take no commission on it. And there's like should be a situation where the apps are kind of dominant and they're able to get like a lot of stake, and they have enough incentive for just like for various reasons in the development like process to run these things. And the loss per year isn't that much because it's not that expensive to run. And I would kind of hope that that's the future.
Okay, so
I mean,
one answer
in
is
fucking Cosmos, validators like might have like 15% commission.
Yeah,
Just like what?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
On the defense of just to place an asterisk in case people don't know how Solana actually works internally. In Solana, there is a cost to running a validator, not just the machine, right? You are paying the transactions, the votes are transactions. If you're voting, that's part of the protocol. This does have a cost for you. If you're one of the smaller validators that the Solana Foundation, the Solana Foundation delegation program, one of the things that they do to incentivize you is that they will cover those voting costs. So in Solana, there is a certain cost. I do agree that that validators, you're not really competing for validators, because chances are most businesses are running validators for multiple things. It's not like there's a dearth of servers out there, or that these things require daily manual care and feeding or some such. So the marginal cost for them to run an extra thing is negligible. And if anyone is wondering, yes, like 49% of the validators, from what I recall, do not take a commission. That means they don't take a commission from the people who are staking with them, so they can attract more stake. But that doesn't mean they're running at a loss necessarily, right? They do still get MEV rewards themselves, and the more stake you have, the more MEV rewards you have. Helios case is a little bit.
Not all, but not even close though. But some distribute that out too. But just
okay. Yeah, fair. That goes into some of that is going to go into the yield. Point is that it's not like doing this out of the goodness of their heart or something, right?
Yeah, no. But I'm not talking just about Solana. And actually, I think one really harmful thing that came out of the Ethereum community was this narrative that somehow like being a validator on Solana is rocket science, like synthetic biology levels of difficult. When and that kind of like is such a strange. Like it paints validators as like these unsung heroes in the trenches, and I mean they are important, of course, and they should be rewarded, adequately for the work value they provide and the work they do. But if you look at sort of all chains, I'm not like picking on any individual chain, and you look at the sort of reward structures and how biased they are towards validators, I think, as a prospective token holder, I would be like, what the hell? Like, this doesn't, the inflation could be, 80-90% lower, and this would still work out for the validator, but it would eat much less of my token holdings.
Maybe to put these two things together, like what you guys said, it's a very good point that like the fact that Solana has like stuff happening on it and like startups and there's like lots of stuff happening, it forces some competitive dynamics into the validator ecosystem, which makes it a lot healthier. But if you just kind of like running the generic L1 something with the same kind of validators who run every kind of version of, you know, the million tender mint chains or whatever, then you don't really have that, and the market kind of just weirdly accepted like these commission rates that don't make any sense. But like just the stuff that a lot of like the things are happening on Solana is really making that like a bit better over time, because there's like someone like Helios, which is very aggressively giving it all back and like running as low margin as possible, trying to get stake away from like Binance and stuff and doing it very well. And just things happening. It's like creating actual value creates actual value, and it creates competitive dynamics in the market that benefit the end user or the end token holder.
Yeah, and I mean it's the same applies to like the stake, the delegated stakes. It's like how much value are they delivering ultimately? Like this isn't so much just like I'm not just like criticizing the models which are applied to validators. Those are sometimes out of whack, and especially when you're bootstrapping, I understand like you need to just get shit working and whatnot. But I'm talking more about stable networks. But when you're like talking about like everyone is just holding, you know, liquid stake token, like, you know, how much do you actually need to inflate the network to reward these people? And yeah, like they're like, if we knew what the optimal staking ratio was, like you would want to do that because you would want to not pay for any extra. But we don't really know what it should be. As a last note, Mika tweeted recently that he had an LP conversation where they had communicated to him that technical understanding was a liability of crypto investing. I wanted to just discuss that a little bit. Do you have a sense of what they meant or like where they were coming from? And curious to kind of dig into
I would
that.
say
If this is the case, we're all fucked.
Yeah, I would say that this kind of investor was a surprisingly big name and like surprisingly crypto kind of like in the sense that they're appreciated in the market. I'll just leave it at that and kind of leave it vague enough where no one will hit me on who it could be.
I mean, to be clear, they might be right.
Yeah,
but
the spirit of the message, I think, was that crypto investing is about the right narrative bandwagon jump, and it's not about even I don't mean like technology and like looking at code, but it's not about finding those like fundamentals that we talked about earlier, the one who will like distribute the most value to their token holders, and the technical lens I think is one way to get at that fundamental and get at that kind of financial profile, which is that okay, this thing, like, will other people want to build on it? Is it good technology? Like, it's part of the understanding the growth of the business. And I think the kind of key message behind was that there was no belief from this person that any sort of key fundamentals matter in that sense, and it's only jumping between these narratives, and it will never be anything else. And that I found to be quite funny. Like how can you but also a person who must be very bullish about crypto and think this can become a large asset class, and then it's very unclear to me like how it becomes a huge asset class without ever producing value to its owners. And this is a question that person is simply not interested in.
So it sounds like this person was basically a product of like this past cycle in a sense, right? Like it actually does make sense in my mind in the short term. Like that is the way kind of like you've had to behave, because everything with fundamentals has been screwed, and the only things that have worked have been like basically trading as meme coins. And so that makes sense. I think what doesn't make sense to me is like that feels like a very short-term trend that's likely to change. But it could be that it takes 10 years, 20, you know, like
Yeah.
we
But
might
maybe
be
the thing,
way off.
Sorry,
in
but
yeah,
the
the
I
thing that is
disagree,
in
honestly.
conflict here really is the idea that they still allocate with a long-term view and to investors who are long-term, but they don't see that the kind of it's anything else but there's nothing but attention, I guess, like in that framework. There is no in this world, in some sense, like a person has kind of the world view in a sense that in this world there is only attention, and there's no like it's not a financial lens to take, like
No, I'm going to go out and say that that's absurd. I mean, honestly, and this is not just because my
it's
background.
not completely absurd.
No, it can work. No, sorry. At the very least, the position that Mika mentioned, that being able to do tech due diligence is detrimental or is net negative, I think is absolutely absurd. You could make short-term bets on things where attention is going to make this stuff skyrocket if your bet is completely liquid and you get out before that attention peters out. So yeah, I think that if you have a nose for the things that may capture people's attention, chances are you're going to outperform, right? Because the scarcest thing out there is attention. However, even like why I wouldn't make a decision based purely on tech due diligence. Tech due diligence can raise flags if they might tell you if there's a ticking time bomb in there, right? Whereas otherwise, I don't know, you made a 3-5 year lock bet on cream or something, and you don't know the code is shit and maintained by a single person, and then it blows up on you, right? Doesn't matter how much attention it had before. So I don't know.
So I mean, yeah, the maybe it's also partly like a lot of how would I put this? I'm not sure what the timing is, but like in a decreasing way, but in the past, a lot of crypto has been about predicting what engineers will like, because it's been quite technical to get involved. And so you've really been trying to just think about like, okay, like where are the developers going to go? And maybe that to a degree has gone away or is going away, where that's actually not the most critical thing. Like the nerdy stuff now is like, and I mean, I can even get on board with this in a sense. Like if I look at some of the nerdy stuff like that I really enjoy, I have no optimism that this shit is going to go mainstream in any sense. It's like running a RISC-V emulator, in a smart contract like this. Who gives a fuck when it comes to like actually building products? Like I kind of agree with that. At the same time, you do have like these things are predictors of products that can be built. And so understanding what the technology allows you to do, allows you to also like forecast what kinds of things may come on the application layer. So there's like multiple ways of approaching it. And the other one is like flags and so on. But I do kind of agree in a sense that like it is very narrative driven. The other way that he might be thinking about it is that development is completely commoditized, and like it's sort of a view of like whatever, we'll just get some developers, like a finance view, it's the Wall Street, like, look, there's this cellar full of like sweaty coders, they'll just do it, like whatever, we'll pay them fine, which is not how it works. But
yeah, and look, man, and for what it's worth, I've brought this one up a few times. I'm much as it pained me to absorb this into my worldview. I do think that Eugene Spartan's whole article of pricing in a clown world is how most of crypto works, right? And that basically means you should add a non-insignificant speculative narrative component to whatever your value formula is. So I agree with that. I agree with the fact that the best tech is not the one that always wins, right? Because it's simply not, and that has nothing to do with crypto. It hasn't been it hasn't been the case since we had tech. Sorry?
And the best tech is also subjective, which I think is often, these are often misconstrued. Like, it's like, oh, this was the best tech. And it's like, well, okay, but like nobody wanted to use it. So was it? Like,
indeed. I mean, suppose God himself came down and gave you a list of 10 inalterable laws of nature to evaluate against. That still doesn't mean that thing is going to win, right? But saying that being able to do tech due diligence is detrimental is just silly, man. I mean, that's cocaine speaking.
Yeah, I'd say like there's a way to steelman the argument. I think quite clearly, which Teemu already did around focusing on other things and tech due diligence not being a deciding factor in a lot of things. Like, and I think that is 100% correct, and more so as the crypto market matures. I would say that there is also no way in this particular situation that the person was making that point that they had a completely different point that they were making, which was in conflict with itself, I would say.
right. Yeah. And like one thing, like I think this sort of points to another question which we've been touching on, which is like, what is the value of mechanism design? Which is slightly different than tech, and it's kind of like, can you build in fundamentals into your project with clever mechanism design? And then maybe this person would have had a different view of that lens versus tech, because just like outputting code is slightly different than what I think of as the tech side of things. Anyway, I think we should call it there. We've been going for longer than we were meant to. We have spoken about various subjects which we didn't plan to.
I don't know. This was pretty structured, I would say. Like,
indeed.
There were exactly three topics, and we kind of got through all of them. So
this was shockingly close to what we had originally thrown around.
Okay, we'll take it. Thank you, everyone, and see you next time.
Ta-ta.